We are.
So anyway, we always kick off the show with headlines, so let's get right to it. Joining us for today's headlines is Howard Yu. How you doing, Howard?
Howard, one of our good friends. He is a Lego professor of innovation at IMD Business School. So welcome back.
My pleasure. It's great to be back.
Always glad to have you from Geneva, Switzerland. We just learned that chatting.
He comes a long way.
It's a long way to join us, you guys.
Only 7 hours, not too long.
Okay, not too long. That's quite a commute, though. But thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm going to ask for some flight tips after you're done, Howard, please, because I'm flying to Milan soon, and 9 hours is a lot for me.
Ooh, that is a long
Yeah.
time. All right, let's start off with our top headline of the week, David. What do we have in this?
Okay, so if you haven't been living in a pineapple under the sea, you'll realize that Boeing 737 MAX 8 and 9 models have been suspended because there were 2 crashes. There was one in Ethiopia, one in Indonesia. Same model, similar circumstances. Oopsie daisy.
And according to a report, experts believe these crashes are due to an anti-stalling system of which pilots were never trained.
So Boeing officials thought, well, we're not changing the plane that much. If you know anything about the 737, it's been around since the late 60s, right? So they just they throw some technology in there and they're like, oh, you don't need any new training. This is the same plane with extra technology. And that way airlines save money.
Howard, can you stress the importance of organizations, companies like Boeing being hyper vigilant in training its employees about new systems and new designs?
Totally. I mean, a plane these days is such a complex system if you think about that. And for engineers, it's very hard for them to understand all the interdependency. And I mean, engineering companies like Airbus or Boeing have the tendency they're going to invent the best product and expect the operator, in this case, the pilot, know what to do. Turns out not to be so simple. I think from an engineering perspective, it's so important to involve the end user from day one so that they actually understand all the implications. You design an interface, in this case, the pilot don't know how to disengage the computer system manually. Make sure they actually design something that are intuitive enough to prevent accident. So it's training and also the way we design something much more humanly intuitive.
Making it more user-friendly, if you will.
Absolutely.
Not as complex, so that in a panic situation, the pilot would know to push a certain, like a button, something that's so simple that could be done like that.
Yeah, and in this situation, it was faulty sensors pointing the nose down, unfortunately, on both flights. And according to most news reports I've read, it was an option to have a light to figure out that was going wrong. So should essential safety features like that be optional, Howard?
Exactly, right? Not only it shouldn't be optional, it should be part of the mandatory design, but also it's this idea you need to think from the angle of the pilot. When they're stressed, when they're frightened, what is that human immediate knee-jerk reaction? Sometimes these designs actually require people to have training before. Now, it's great to have classroom training, but when you're panicking, everything out of the window. So you've got to think also from a design perspective. What is humanly intuitive so that in crisis situation, we actually press the correct button.
That's a good point. So we were just talking about businesses implementing training for new business models. Do you have examples of some businesses that could enforce better policies on training their employees?
Yeah, I think from a training perspective, it's also about engagement, empowerment as well. So if you looked at companies such as Toyota, right, they really have a good way of thinking about the production system, how to engage all the workers on the assembly line. If they see something's wrong, they can pull the cord and stop the assembly line, and all the workers together would problem solve to identify the root cause. So rather than thinking about solution from on high, you empower people to come up with a solution. They own it up. So I think that mentality is important.
Right. And it's also important to note too, how long would it take a company to roll out its new system and or train the employees? Like, what's a standard amount of time? Do you spend 6 months before you even test run?
Yeah.
What does that model look like?
Right. It really depending on how you design your rollout plan. So if you engage your key stakeholders, the pilot, the field worker from day one, then you can roll it out rather rapidly because you have all this feedback up front.
Right.
But if you try to invent the best product in the dark and expect to do a big bang and it will be great, very risky and it takes a lot more time. So it requires a different way of working. among these big companies.
Yeah, well, you were talking about Kaizen when you were talking about Toyota. You know, in Japanese corporations, it's about the institutional learning.
Right.
They have a word for institutional learning. It's like Toyota is learning.
Something.
Like they remember when they had their pedal problem a few
Right.
years ago, right? They learned from that. And that's an essential part of Japanese culture.
And I hope the companies are learning too from all of these recalls, airbag recalls and all of these. And I'm like, are they learning? Because I feel like every month I'm getting a flyer that I need to take my car in because there's a recall in the airbag or the gas pedal's not working, the brake's not working. Okay, so what is it called? Toyota, the learning.
Oh, Kaizen, right?
Or
That's
Kaizen.
right.
Yeah.
Kaizen.
Yeah.
All right, well, of course, here, we at Bold TV extend our condolences to the family and friends of those who lost a loved one during these crashes.
And there were a lot of international aid workers on that flight as well as, Kenyans and Ethiopians just traveling. And it's really sad because a lot of the people who died were genuinely interested in, helping make the world a better place. It's really sad. So anyway, moving on to our next headline. According to an article by the New York Times, Facebook denounced it would stop allowing advertisers in key categories to show their messages only to people of a certain race, gender, age group, and zip code.
So here's what the situation is. The site will no longer allow anyone advertising housing, jobs, or credit to have the option to explicitly target people on the basis of those characteristics.
So we would be targeted differently then.
Absolutely.
Yeah, different zip code, different gender, different race, etc. So Howard, what do you think about this ad restriction here?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a reflection that people no longer expect or accept Facebook simply is a neutral platform. Whenever you try to do ads more in a targeted way, implicitly you're taking a stand. And it has implication from, race to income, social, economic level, right? So I think this is a good move that we restrict in terms of targeting to make it more fair, but I don't think it's radical enough. Because in many ways, from news feed to all kind of features right now, what we've seen, it remained opaque. We don't understand behind the algorithm.
Do they
how
even
the
understand the
Facebook-
algorithm changes all the time, Howard?
So many changes.
I think it's a combination of both. They keep it secret and they may not even know all the implication as well, which I think part of the emerging understanding is we need to pry open these black boxes, allowing independent auditor to scrutinize. It's no longer a sort of recipe of Coca-Cola you can keep secretive because the implication to the larger society is so big, it requires a collective dialogue. It should allow independent auditor to make sure these algorithms are fair, are safe, and also espouse to the value our society would agree upon.
When I read this, I immediately thought about businesses and how it would affect their marketing strategies.
Yeah.
Right? If they're targeting David, white male, New York City, works in TV.
I'm white, Hispanic,
Hispanic.
married.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
specifics. But how would it affect business and their marketing strategy? Well, businesses across the world, really, around the world.
Right. So in the past, people kind of don't know how advertisement, how much you spend and the effectiveness. And of course, the big promise is you know exactly the impact. Now, it used to be it's great for businesses, but I think now it reaches the point people find it almost repugnant. Why do you show me this particular ad so targeted, right?
Sometimes it's a little bit scary.
It's a little creepy.
It's creepy,
Why are these
right.
shoes popping in my feed every time I log on? Yeah.
Right.
No, but it's also like certain lifestyle stuff and certain ethnic stuff. Like I speak Portuguese, but I'm not Brazilian, and I get a bunch of targeted ads in Portuguese, and it's like, wow, you guys figured
very niche.
that out. Yeah.
Yeah, I once read a book, Google on Amazon, on even like an octopus book about octopus. The next thing I know, they were selling me a hat looks like octopus. I was like, really?
Wow. It's crazy how they find out the
They
information.
know everything.
So, Howard, how should internet companies apply stricter safeguards in handling user information?
Oh yeah, there are good news as well emerging these days from Europe. For example, there's this whole guideline around GDPR. You need to safeguard personal information, and before you collect information, you need to spell out what exactly is the purpose for, and you cannot repurpose for other usage as well. So that's a good starting point. But I think going forward, we see almost every day there's a scandal around Facebook, right? It's almost these engineers.
There was one this morning. I had a radio interview about it. The apps on Android were sharing information with Facebook, Yelp, Duolingo, etc. And people were like, "Oh, do you think the higher ups know?" And I've said absolutely not. I really don't think so. I think Facebook and all these .com companies have grown so fast that it's hard to keep everything a lid on everything, honestly.
Right, and you're looking at other sector, how do they cope with this complexity? Independent auditor. From healthcare to pharmaceutical to finance, there's always independent unit from the outside to make sure it's safe, it's fair. And why don't we apply the same mentality into our big tech industry?
Interesting. Good point, Howard.
Yeah, Howard has some great perspectives as always. Let's transition to our final headline. Spotify's CEO Daniel Ek announced the company has filed a suit against Apple with the European Commission over anti-competitive practices.
Well, they weren't just going to go into the night quietly. So days later, Apple released a statement on its website titled Addressing Spotify's Claims, where it dismantled some of Spotify's accusations without addressing its demands.
Howard, do you think mobile app companies in particular have a constraint on innovation for tech companies like Spotify?
I mean, totally, right? You have no other distribution channel. You have to play on the ecosystem. So you're Spotify, you cannot afford not to play within the iOS Apple system. And the problem with Apple these days, as well as Android, because they are so big now, as a small startup or even an app developers like Spotify, you are subject to all kinds of tactics that could slow your innovation. For example, Spotify alert that Apple has been slow in approving their app version, right? Or they don't allow Siri to be plug and play within the Spotify.
And they're developing their own music app. Let's not forget that.
That's exactly the big problem. When you, as Apple or Android, you're not just making the market, but you're also participating in the market, then there could be conflict of interest, unfair advantages, right? And it's way beyond the extent we've seen, such as Walmart launching their private label. This is not that. This is like you create this gigantic shopping mall and you have your own retail chain to compete with your tenant. Now, in the financial industry, it's not allowed. For example, if you're an investment banker like Goldman Sachs, you advise an M&A deal to a client, you cannot trade their stock in the open market. And yet somehow in the high-tech firm, you can both creating the market and participating within. So it's sort of unfair competitive advantage. I do worry about that.
But let me push back a little bit on that. And honestly, I agree with you, Howard. But here's the thing. We learned with technology, especially with the Microsoft lawsuit in the late 90s that accused Microsoft of being a monopoly, technology is all about universality, right? We need one platform. Right? So it's really hard to say, oh, they have too much market power. What, do we want like more competition? Already having Droid and iPhones is a massive nuisance, right? That we have two systems. We really can't have any more than two platforms realistically in the technology world, can we?
Right. So I agree that we don't want to have too many fragmented platforms, but what you don't want is these platform players to also provide their own services to compete with third party as well. That becomes unfair. So it's okay to just have iOS in a hypothetical world, but you want it to be neutral, like net neutrality. You don't want to favor one guy versus the other, particularly if you make the market and you play within the market. That's problematic.
Amazon's the one that gets a lot of flack for that because when you go shopping, Lindsay.
I was just on Amazon yesterday.
And did you buy Amazon products?
No.
Like my wet wipes and my dishwashing detergent and my I don't know what
other
else.
vendors.
Nope, I use Amazon stuff. They have some of the best stuff and they undercut their competitors. Exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, Amazon Basic is a big private label brand, and they also have third-party marketplace and competing against the Amazon their own merchandise as well. So it's all very convoluted in terms of rules of the games, and it's not good for competition.
Well, Howard, it's always nice to have you around. Great insight.
Making that 7-hour commute to join us.
It's my great pleasure. Lovely to be here again.
Love to have you back, of course.